After a long time, we finally return to my series, where I go bit by bit through Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films and explain all the lore references and backstory from the book's perspective, but also the book differences if possible. I ended the last episode with a cliffhanger, teasing to talk about the story behind the Hobbit's pipeweed and the birthday party of Bilbo. We come to this in a moment. As always, I try to pronounce names as Tolkien described it, which means a lot of rolled R's. I use the extended edition of the films and, of course, spoiler warning. Concerning pipeweed. In The Lord of the Rings, there is in fact a part of the prologue chapter with this name, and it would not be Tolkien's work if there wasn't a backstory. As you often see in the films or read in the books, hobbits, but also some men, dwarves and even the wizards like to smoke, which shows a bit the age of the books. Tolkien himself was a pipe smoker too, as seen in this picture. Interestingly, according to Meriadoc Brandybuck's herb lore book, pipeweed or halfling's leaf, which is Nicotiana, did not originate from Middle-earth. The Dún Edain, the Westmen, brought it over to Middle-earth from their homeland, the kingdom of Númenor, which is a big island between the continents Middle-earth and Aman from the Second Age. Aragorn's ancestors are from this island, and he is also a Dún Edain, related to their line of kings, as explained in my Aragorn video. The Númenóreans built settlements in Middle-earth, especially after helping the elves in the War of the Elves and Sauron in the Second Age, so in the centuries directly after the One Ring was created by the Dark Lord. I assume around this time they brought it over to Middle-earth. Well-known settlements were Londdair, Tharbad or Sarnford, all in Eriador, relatively close to the Shire, but they also had Pelargir and used the havens of Umbar in the south. Men knew this herb under the name Westman's weed or Galenas, and it seems that it existed first in Gondor, around the lower Anduin, but men only esteemed it for the smell of its flowers, not making tobacco out of it. It somehow went up the Greenway to Bree or Bree, and there the Bree hobbits developed the custom of smoking. So smoking tobacco seems to be an invention of the hobbits, at least according to Merry and his herb lore. In the films you hear the name Old Toby several times. It's named after the hobbit who most likely brought it from Bree to the Shire, Tobald Hornblower. He grew it in his garden in Longbottom, South Farthing in the Shire. I explained the districts or farthings of the Shire in my previous episode. Longbottom leaf and Southern Star are other well-known varieties of pipeweed, and with this it becomes clear that pipeweed from South Farthing is quite popular in Middle-earth. Even Saruman had 2 barrels of Longbottom leaf in Isengard, which can also be seen in the extended edition of The Two Towers and is also mentioned in the books. Interestingly, in the unfinished tales we can read that Saruman once scolded Gandalf because he was annoyed by the smoke of his pipe. This was during a meeting of the White Council, 3rd Age 2851, so Saruman seems to have changed his mind about it since then. It's also interesting that it can be assumed that Gandalf got closer to the Hobbit culture around this time, about 100 years earlier during the Long Winter to be precise. The last and first White Council meeting was 3rd Age 2463, so he met the Hobbits most likely somewhere between the first meeting and the Long Winter, where he aided the Hobbits. Speaking of Gandalf, he is known for his fireworks, even by a young Bilbo in The Hobbit, and Gandalf knows Bilbo's mother Belladonna Took. We can see her and her young son in the extended edition of the first Hobbit film. Also in the Fellowship of the Ring we see a portrait of her and her husband and Bilbo's father Bungo Baggins at the wall in Bag End. Her appearance is similar to Peter Jackson's wife and screenwriter of all 6 films, Fran Welch. The portrait of Bilbo's father looks of course similar to Peter Jackson, a funny little cameo. Belladonna is also the daughter of Gerontius Took, better known as Old Took, who is referenced a lot. He too can be seen in the extended edition of the first Hobbit. Gandalf of course knew him, and it was probably from Old Took's Midsummer Eve parties that he became known for his fireworks. I assume this is also what this scene depicts. Moving on, in the Fellowship of the Ring film, we have the scene with Gandalf and Frodo on the wagon and the children who want to see Gandalf's fireworks. The wizard gives them a small demonstration. In the books, Frodo meets Gandalf not on his way to Bilbo, but most likely when he arrives at Bag End. Their children come and ask for fireworks too, but here they have to wait until the party starts. The scenes at the beginning in the Shire are full of those little details and references from the books, but often placed in a different order or changed a little bit to fit the flow of the film. Sometimes also characters are switched. It's quite difficult to cover all details in chronological order, so the following section is a bit messy in that regard. Another small detail, Gandalf sings "The road goes ever on and on", which Bilbo recites, or a variation of it, when he returns home from his adventure in the Hobbit book, but also when he leaves the Shire in Lord of the Rings. He sings it in the Fellowship film too. When Bilbo recites it in The Hobbit, Gandalf is present, so he could have known it. I assume it's a bit of a reference. The quest for Erebor ended with Bilbo's return to the Shire and the song, and the new quest for the One Ring begins with it too. It also transports that in Tolkien's works characters tend to sing a lot. The dialogue between Frodo and Gandalf about the wizard being declared a disturber of peace is also in the books, but it happens after the birthday party, and in fact Gandalf tells Frodo about this, not the other way around as in the films. Another detail, one of the maps shown when Frodo tells Gandalf about Bilbo's strange behavior and him looking at old maps, the map shows the region around Gondor, and the names are written in the Elvish Tengwar writing system, which surprised me. This is also a small difference. In the books, Frodo knows about Bilbo's plan to leave from the beginning. Next is Gandalf arrives at Bag End and knocks on the door, but Bilbo thinks the visitor is another unpleasant distant relative until he hears Gandalf's voice. In the books, this beginning part is different too. Bilbo expects Gandalf and he unloads his wagon, but doesn't fire up a small example of his fireworks for the staring hobbits and children, as mentioned, but vanishes inside Bag End instead. Also, the sign at the garden door is mentioned in the books too. For the inside scenes, the filmmakers put in a tremendous amount of work to generate the illusion of different scales. For example, they built the set of Bag End 2 times identically, one small-scale version and one large-scale version. Every item you see exists in 2 sizes. Even 17 years later, the illusion still impresses me. But back to the story. It's also interesting that in the books another wagon arrived shortly before Gandalf that was driven by dwarves, who helped Bilbo with his party preparations. Lord of the Rings was somewhat planned as a sequel to The Hobbit, and the original Hobbit book from 1937 was changed a bit to fit into the Lord of the Rings universe. This second edition of it was released around 1951, and the first Lord of the Rings book 1954, even though all books were done by then. I can imagine that the appearance of dwarves is a bit of a reference or tribute to The Hobbit. In a sequel, dwarves in the Shire can't miss, I guess. In the film Inside Bag End, Bilbo and Gandalf talk, and here we have the dialogue about Bilbo's plan to leave the Shire and that he wants to see mountains again, which is also in the books, with small changes, but again at a different place. There it happens when he meets with Gandalf in Bag End after he vanished from his birthday party. After rewatching and rereading the beginning, it definitely impressed me how many dialogues or dialogue snippets from the books were used in these scenes and how well the actors interpret them. Here a few more little details from inside Bag End after Gandalf arrived there. At the wall we see the mentioned portraits of Fran Welch as Belladonna Took or later Baggins and Peter Jackson as Bungo Baggins. Gandalf also holds up Thror's map from the quest of Erebor. I could not find out what happened to it after The Hobbit, but it was last mentioned when they opened the secret door of the Lonely Mountain, so it's possible to be in Bilbo's possession as keepsake. After this, the Sackville Bagginses knock on the door. In the books, the problematic relationship between Bilbo and them is of course explained too, but at a different place. It's tied to the dialogue in the first Tavern part, which is also partially and a bit changed in the extended edition, but happens later in the films. In the books, it takes place right at the beginning, even before Gandalf arrives. You see, the order is very different, but some of the details are still there. In the books, Sam's father, called Gaffer, mentions it in the tavern. We come to this scene later. Next in the films is Bilbo's birthday party. Here we learn about Sam and Rosie. She's mentioned much later in the books, but of course it's indicated that she and Sam knew each other for a very long time, far before he leaves the Shire. This later chapter, where she's introduced, called The Scouring of the Shire, which plays after the destruction of the One Ring, is also missing in the movies completely, so it makes sense to introduce their relationship here. The idea that she works in the Green Dragon Inn is an invention of the films though. Some of the fireworks we see are also described in the books, like the one with the children and the butterflies. Also the big dragon firework, which at first frightened all the hobbits and they take cover. A big difference though, Merry and Pippin had nothing to do with it. In the films they are little troublemakers, but in the books they are far less. Especially Merry is at this party 19 and Pippin only 11 years old, while Frodo is 33. When Frodo reaches Rivendell, he is 50, Merry 36 and Pippin 28, so they are of course less goofy by that age, especially Merry. As mentioned in the last episode, Bilbo welcomes some of the hobbits like Fredegar Bolger, also called Fatty Bolger. I will most likely talk about him in the next episode, because he helps Frodo to leave the Shire. Still, a nice reference even mentioning him by name in the film. Speaking of Frodo, as explained in my last video, it's not only Bilbo's 111th birthday, but also Frodo's 33rd. Both have birthday at the exact same day, and the 33rd was also a special birthday in Hobbit culture, meaning the coming of age and leaving the irresponsible tweens behind. Then we have this small scene where Bilbo hides from the Sackville Bagginses with Frodo and wants to tell him about his plans, but can't. In the books, Bilbo mentions to Gandalf that Frodo offered to come with him on his journey before the party. As explained, he knows about it, but that he was still in love with the Shire. I assume this is a bit referenced in this scene again and in the earlier dialogue with Gandalf in Bag End. When it comes to the Sackville Bagginses in the books, they will leave the party angry after Bilbo's speech, and Frodo has to deal with them the next day. His speech is very similar to the books, even the Proudfeet part. Still, it's a bit shorter and he leaves out some names. The biggest difference in the books is that when Bilbo vanishes with the help of the One Ring, Gandalf casts a flash to take the blame for the trick a bit, so nobody would suspect or could interpret it as Bilbo having a magical ring. This is also the reason why Gandalf becomes a disturber of peace. People suspect that he and Frodo plotted against Bilbo to get his treasures, which also shows a bit of Hobbit culture, telling stories and rumors about what happened in their small society. Of course, this small detail misses in the films completely, but the later tavern scene tries to capture a bit of this gossip culture and does a good job, but is sadly missing in the cinema version. Now comes the ring part in Bag End, which is very similar to the books too, besides that parts of the dialogues were moved to other places, as mentioned. This is probably one of my favorite scenes in Lord of the Rings, and I really like Peter Jackson's interpretation of it. It shows the struggle that the One Ring can be and how it can change the bearer. It's also impressive that Bilbo in the end manages to leave without taking the One Ring with him. 3,000 years of history in Middle-earth have led to this point. If Bilbo keeps the ring, Sauron could have won in the end. But with Gandalf's help, Bilbo transcends his will over the power of the One Ring and drops it on the floor. The audio commentary mentioned that they used a magnet under the ground, so the ring does not bounce up again and has this heavier impact, as explained by Grant Major, the production designer. So the prop ring was not made out of pure gold for this to work. They also had a very big version of the One Ring for some of the closer shots, which looks quite funny. In the books, the ring together with Bilbo's will and documents are inside an envelope, and Bilbo tries to leave it on the mantelpiece, but in his struggle drops it before, so that it fell on the ground. Gandalf picked it up before him and placed the envelope on the mantelpiece himself. Bilbo looked angry for a moment, but did not give in to it and looked relieved and laughed. So all seems a bit more accidental than in the films. Still, Bilbo left the ring and managed to continue without it, even though he had it for 60 years. I like how Peter Jackson and Bilbo's actor Ian Holm portray the struggle and inner fight in the scene. Sir Ian Holm also played Frodo in the BBC radio adaptation from 1981, which is a nice reference in of itself, but he is of course also a brilliant actor. I also like how they depicted Bilbo becoming suddenly more and more angry, arguing, and Gandalf shows him how it looks when he becomes angry, which is a pretty accurate interpretation of what is described in the books. After the One Ring is on the mantelpiece in an envelope, Bilbo finally leaves and sings his walking song, accompanied by 3 dwarves who waited outside. So some small differences to the films, but a lot of details are still there. For example, Gandalf whispers, "Goodbye, my dear Bilbo, until our next meeting," while watching how Bilbo vanishes into the dark singing. And so it also happens in the films. They captured this so well. Next in the films, Gandalf tries to touch the ring lying on the floor, and we see the fiery eye of Sauron. This will be a topic that I will often mention in this series. The eye is more a metaphor in the books. Later in the film trilogy, we see it above Barad-dûr, and the cinematic cut implies this is Sauron's form. The extended edition changes this depiction a bit later. We, for example, have scenes where we can see a physical Sauron inside the red eye. The books indicate that Sauron has always a physical form during Lord of the Rings, and there's nothing written about a fiery eye above Barad-dûr. I assume this change was necessary for the medium film, because Sauron is not really described in the books. He has no dialogue. He is just this abstract concept of evil, so terrible that nobody even dares to speak about him. And this deity is always a threat without being physically there. I personally call these type of characters constructs. Film has a hard time with this due to its visual nature. Therefore, films can do other things that are difficult in books. The Nazgul scene in Bree is a good example, which is also something Peter Jackson explains in his audio commentary, and I would agree. However, in the films they show how Gandalf actively avoids touching the One Ring after his first try, but in the books Gandalf touches the ring several times in backend, even holding it up, and the fiery eye vision does not appear in his mind. Interestingly, in this book dialogue between Bilbo and Gandalf after the party, we have probably the first reference that Peter Jackson most likely used for his Sauron's eye interpretation. Bilbo says to Gandalf about the ring, "Sometimes I have felt it was like an eye looking at me." And I think this is referenced often in the films. Next is Frodo's arrival, and we also see the mentioned envelope in the films. It has moved a bit. They briefly talk and Gandalf leaves the Shire, promising his return. Cut and we see Barad-dûr in Mordor and hear Gollum's voice saying Shire, Baggins, then the Nazgul leave Minas Morgul. Now the big differences begin. In the books, Frodo also talks briefly with Gandalf, but has to talk to the remaining guests too, who most likely delayed Frodo leaving the party, so he would miss Bilbo. Most of the guests didn't find Bilbo's joke funny and were quite angered. Rumors spread over a long time, and as explained earlier, Gandalf became a disturber of peace. Next day, Frodo has to resolve a lot of confusion with the Hobbits, and Gandalf talks to him in more detail until he leaves to his research in, for example, the archives of Minas Tirith. We see Gandalf riding there, and the film does not explain this place, which is a decision I like. When he walks through the streets, we have some little cameos of the film crew, and the actor of the man in the archives also portrays the elvish Cinder Lord, Círdan the Shipwright, who we can see in the prologue and at the end of Return of the King. If you're interested in his story and the elvish lore from his perspective, I have a very long video dedicated to him. With Gandalf doing research, we have a pretty big time skip in the books and a lot of story that has not made it into the films, which I will be covering most likely in the next video, at least to some degree. For comparison, Bilbo's birthday party is 3rd Age 3001. Frodo leaving the Shire is 3rd Age 3018, so 17 years are in between and a few things happen there. For example, how Aragorn captures Gollum after he is released from Mordor, but also some things happen on the way to Bree. The last thing I want to cover for this video is the Tavern scene from the extended edition, because it's partially from the beginning of the first chapter in the book. The first difference is that in the books there are 2 inns, the Ivy Bush and the Green Dragon. And there are also 2 dialogue scenes in each of them that fuse to one scene in the films. The last one is in the Green Dragon, when Frodo is about 50, some months before he leaves the Shire. It's a conversation between Frodo, Sam and Ted Sandyman, the miller's son. The other scene is in the Ivy Bush with Gaffer, that's Sam's father, the miller Sandyman, Old Noakes and Daddy Twofoot. Gaffer, or Hamfast Gamgee, was the gardener of Bilbo for a long time, until his son Sam took over his job when he got older. Gaffer defended Bilbo and Frodo against the miller's remarks of Back End being a queer place, and he also explains how Frodo's parents died. The miller is not very likable, and Gaffer dislikes him too with his remarks. There was also the rumor of Bilbo having tunnels full of gold under Back End, but Gaffer's arguments that this is not the case could not convince the other hobbits in the tavern. They also spoke about Bilbo's relation to the Sackville Bagginses. The line, "They never forgave me for living this long," is derived from this conversation. The other conversation, about 17 years later in The Green Dragon, was about Frodo and Bilbo being cracked people, a phrase we hear in the films too, and how strange folk has been seen at their borders. If you have seen my Endwife video, it is in this conversation where Sam mentions that his uncle has seen a giant tree man in the Norse moors. Also, when the Nazgul, who is the only known by name Khamul, arrives in the Shire around this time, he asks Gaffer Gamgee about Baggins. In the films, it's, I assume, Farmer Maggot, and we see him and his dog slowly hiding in his smile. And even though the Shire part is almost over in the films and Bree isn't far away, the books have some more stories to tell until we get there. Thank you for watching. This episode was incredibly difficult to structure, but I hope you still enjoyed it. Not sure how I will handle next episode, because a lot of it is actually not in the films, but quite interesting, including Tom Bombadil. We will see how far I can get. If you liked this episode, feel free to press the like button and leave a comment. I would be interested in how much detail you wish on the book differences part. Also, if you are interested in more Lord of the Rings lore, I have plenty of videos on my channel. Next will be the video answering the question you have voted for. Right now, the afterlife of the different races is in the lead. I also would love to make one gaming related video after that and more answering questions from the comments videos. So if you have lore questions, I'll keep an eye on the comment sections of my videos. Again, thank you for watching and goodbye.